In this video, we will go through the operations on complex numbers. So there are quite a few different operations. I will try to get through them as quickly as possible so you don't have to watch a 20-minute video here. But first, it's important to understand that every second power of I equals -1, every fourth power of I equals 1. So a lot of times when we're reducing an I squared or an I to a power, people will write it as, I squared to the first, or I to the fourth to some power. This, of course, would mean that I have -1 to the first, which is -1. Whereas they would take an odd value like this and say, well, this is I squared times I, so 3 i's total. This would give me -1. This, of course, is I, so it's just -I. I to the fourth, I could just replace with 1. Or some might write that as -1 squared, because that would be, of course, I squared. And the last one I would write as I to the fourth times I. I to the fourth is replaced with 1. 1 times I is I. Now, when you get to these larger values, that's when you kind of have to choose. In this case, I would write I to the 9th as I to the fourth squared, which would be 8 of them, with an I left over. So that's 9 total. So 4 times 2 is 8 plus the 1. I to the fourth is 1. 1 squared is, of course, 1 times I, which would be just I. I to the 34th, again, you're going to write I to the fourth to what power? So how many times would 4 go into 34 evenly? Which would be 8, with just 1 I left over. So, 8 I squared left over. Did the math wrong there. So this I to the fourth is 1, and 1 to the 8th is, of course, 1. I squared is -1. So really, I have 1 8 times and a -1, so my answer is -1. And the last one, I to the -7th. So this negative means it's actually 1 over I to the 7th. So I to the 7th is I to the fourth, I squared, and I. So I'm just breaking it into parts because I know I to the fourth is 1. I squared is -1, and of course I. So I have 1 over -I would be my final answer there. Here are 3 of those for you to try before we move on to the next questions. The first, again, I to the 17th. I would say I to the 17th is I to the fourth 4 times, so that's 16 of them with 1 left over. This is 1 to the fourth, which is, of course, 1 times I, which would just give me I. Write as many steps in there as you would like. I to the 105th, again, I'm going to write I to the fourth how many times? So I to the fourth 26 times, because 26 times 4 is 104, with an I left over. So this is essentially 1 to the 26th times I, which is just I, or 1I. Last one, I to the -40 means 1 over I to the 40. So let's write that as 1 over I to the fourth 10 times. Well, I to the fourth we know is 1, and 1 to the 10th is 1, so really I just have 1.